The werewolf and other shapeshifters have been utilized in artistic mediums as an allegory for a number of things: mental health and physical health, repressed desires, budding sexuality, and puberty. Werewolves are more a fear of self than a fear of others, unlike many mythological beings and literary monsters. From Werewolf of London to Ginger Snaps, the werewolf legend as we know it has evolved on screen. In this series, we will be discussing the history of the werewolf and the werewolf on film. Hello, I'm Ainsley, and this is the Quiet Riot, where we talk film, television, and media. Welcome back for returning viewers and subscribers, and welcome to the show. I've wanted to talk about werewolf lore for a really long time, and here specifically we are talking about werewolf lore in Hollywood, as well as the overall expansion and how it has evolved. And the majority of this conversation is going to go around Werewolf of London, which is a movie released in 1935 by Universal Studios. Now, if I were to go up to anybody on the street and ask them, like, hey, do you know the movie The Wolfman? And they probably know what it is, even if they haven't seen it. But that is a little bit different with Werewolf of London. Now, this movie has inspired quite a bit when it comes to pop culture. Werewolf of London, it has inspired the song, and it's also inspired other films, and we will get a little bit more into that today as well. All of my research will be in the description box below, and that will teach you a lot more about the werewolf lore through history, particularly through various different cultures, from Mesopotamia to Scandinavia to indigenous cultures right here in the US. Unlike films featuring vampire and witches, movies with werewolves feature lore established in an early film, not from centuries of myths and literature. What we know as werewolf lore began in 1930s Hollywood with Werewolf of London. In 1935, the film was an inspiration for the 80s classic An American Werewolf of London and its sequel. Unlike the mythology that came before it, the werewolf became a hybrid where the man had no control over his transformation into a wolf. Much of what we now recognize as werewolf lore originates from this film. The movie inspired many from the subgenre to follow, including the more commercially successful The Wolfman. From one side of the earth to the other, there are several different interpretations of werewolf lore, and something like it. It is believed that the original werewolf lore, or where it kind of originated, was in Mesopotamia, and we also have seen stories coming out of Scandinavia, such as that where father and son put on wolf pelts and end up turning into wolves, and the dad bites the son and it's nearly fatal. And you also have the story of the skinwalker from the Navajo here, and unfortunately the skinwalker has become very bastardized in various TikToks and as well as different books and films, and it doesn't really look like the original folklore and the original stories from Navajo people. So I will link as much as I can below to learn more from indigenous people from the Navajo, to learn more about what skinwalkers actually are. What a lot of these have in common is that they come from witchcraft or black magic, and people are turned into wolves based on being cursed by them. Sometimes they have more control over turning, sometimes they'll never turn back into a human. For the most part, it is nothing like what we have come to know as the werewolf legends of today. There were actually werewolf trials happening in Europe. It's insane to think, but there was also witch trials, and what's also incredibly sad is, much like the witch trials, some of what they called werewolfery were people who suffered from lycanthropy, where they had a mental illness that made them believe that they were a wolf or that they would turn into a wolf. You also had people that were just deathly sick, and you also have people who have a lot of hair on their body. I believe a gene mutation that causes it. I will also put some things in the description box below to learn more about that, because I don't want to misinform anybody. But there were many reasons why people in Europe believed people to be werewolves or would turn into a werewolf. And sometimes illnesses of both physical and mental, as well as just other people's ignorance, caused them to believe that people were werewolves. And they were put on trial and they were hurt because of it. Prior to the 1920s, Indigenous pictures were popular, and writer Ruth Ann Baldwin wrote about a Navajo woman believing that her husband has left her turns into a witch. The short film was lost in the Universal Fire of 1924 and became one of the many films that were lost. It is believed that The Werewolf is the first film to feature werewolves, but the curse came from the use of witchcraft and a thirst for revenge and not a bite from a werewolf. The film was adapted from the short story The Werewolves, released in 1898 by Henry Beaugrand. Directed by Henry Gray, The Werewolf is thought to be the first werewolf film and the first Universal monster movie that turns into a witch following her husband's departure, and that 100 years after her daughter's death, the daughter resurrects to take revenge on the settlers. Also written by Baldwin, The Legend of the Phantom Tribe was directed by McCrae. By means of double exposure, a whole tribe of Indians slain in battle is resurrected. Through witchcraft, one of the braves is turned into a bear. Also released in 1914, The White Wolf has an indigenous theme with someone's spirit embodied within a wolf. I got as much as I possibly could on these. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of detail. Wolf Blood, A Tale of the Forest was released in 1925. Wolf Blood follows a man who, after a transfusion, believes that he is turning into a wolf. It is widely believed to be the first surviving werewolf film. The film was released in 1935, and it is the first werewolf talkie and feature-length film. It would begin a trend in horror popularized in the 1941 film The Wolfman. While Werewolf of London failed to gain the popularity of its predecessor, the film had an impact on not only the film industry, but an entire mythology. Several books have been written, films and television series have been produced, and other forms of entertainment have featured the werewolf as what we know it today. A person who had been bitten by a wolf, who then turns into a wolf on the full moon. This is not part of mythology that has existed over centuries. It began with a Universal Pictures movie that is often forgotten. Werewolf of London created its very own lore that would become a part of Hollywood lore and beyond. Werewolf of London follows a botanist who searches for a plant while in Tibet. On his search, he is bitten by a werewolf, and when he returns home, he begins to change. The film contributed heavily to werewolf lore that is popular in film today. The fact that a werewolf is half man, half wolf, that being bitten by a werewolf will make you one, and changing under the full moon was made up entirely for the film. It's really crazy to see how much this film has impacted werewolf lore within film, but also how it has further done so in literature and beyond that, because I wasn't aware really. I thought that there were different aspects of werewolf lore that existed, but I didn't realize that a lot of these things that we so associate with it exist because of film. While Werewolf of London was not a financial nor critical success upon its release, its impact is seen in every project featuring a werewolf. After all, if not for this film, the lore might be very different. In the New York Times, Frank S. Nugent called the film a charming bit of lycanthropy, and ended his review by making reference to the fact that Werewolf of London was the last film to be shown at New York Rialto Theater before it was torn down and rebuilt. It's hard to say exactly why the world was not ready for Werewolf of London. It would be 6 years later, they would be ready for the Wolfman, and the Wolfman managed to take the world by storm. Unfortunately, Werewolf of London did not get that praise. Even though it did get some praise upon its release, it just wasn't as loved and appreciated as that movie. There were a lot of things that were going on and changing within Hollywood during the 1930s, and you have something released in 1931, and the 1930s were kind of a birth of horror within the film, because horror wasn't really existing a lot in Hollywood. There was things being imported into Hollywood, but we weren't creating a lot of horror. And so I think when you have these different horror stories coming out in the 1930s, there was a lot more comparison than there really should be. Whatever the reason, Werewolf of London may not have been a success upon its release, but has since become a pulp culture icon. From inspiring the werewolf lore to the song Werewolves of London, this 30s horror film is one for the history books. Jack Pierce did the makeup for this film, and its original design was a lot hair heavy, and they decided to reject that for a more minimalist approach. That way you could essentially see the character that is the werewolf and see the human that they are as well. And I do like that. I think that basically went on to inspire, if anyone remembers, Big Wolf on Campus, and probably some other films as well, where the characteristics of the human are still seen and they're not necessarily, you can still see that's who that is, which in many ways, from a perspective of seeing that, it adds a different kind of horror element to it, which I really like. It has often been reported that Pierce's design was simplified because Henry Hull was unwilling to endure the hours that it would have taken to apply the original version of the makeup, or that Hull did not want his face obscured because of vanity. According to his great-nephew, Coeur d'Alene Hull, however, Hull, an accomplished makeup artist in his own right, argued that Pierce's original design obscured his face so much that it would contradict the script, which specified that other characters were able to recognize the werewolf as Glendon. 6 years later, Pierce was able to use a design closely resembling his original version when he worked with Lon Chaney Jr. on The Wolfman. While I completely understand why Pierce would not like this, I do think in the end it really worked in the specifics of the film's favor, and if there is something in the script while they're recognizing Glendon, it is important for us as an audience to also be able to recognize him, and so I'm certainly glad that they made those changes. But it was cool that he was able to go and work on The Wolfman 6 years later and utilize that makeup choice that he had decided on originally for Werewolf of London. The werewolf howl in this film is often considered the most realistic wolf howl, as it blends both the real howl of a timber wolf and Hull's actual voice, and so it ends up sounding more realistic and just generally being more realistic. Unfortunately, this technique has never been used again after that, which is very weird to me. So, in the beginning of the film, Glendon is talking to some locals when he's in Tibet, and the Tibetans are actually speaking Cantonese rather than what they would actually speak, and Hall is just basically muttering gibberish. I don't know why they couldn't speak their language that they speak, and that Hall couldn't at least do maybe a broken English or something, and broken Tibetan and some broken Tibetan. I feel like they still are, when it comes to some films today, they're still very lazy with language. As I had previously mentioned, the makeup in this film had really inspired other films as well and had been utilized. And I did mention Big Wolf on Campus, which is not mentioned in my notes, but what is mentioned here is that the design was also used in the 1994 film Wolf, as well as the television series Penny Dreadful. And it's not the exact design, but it does take inspiration as a more minimalist design. Despite not getting the critical praise that it deserved at the time of its release, nor the commercial success that I think it also deserved, the film has gone on to inspire many more, including The Wolfman that was released 6 years later. Again, it inspired various different films, television series, as well as books and the lore around it. It's basically created its own mythology without even meaning to. Not everything that is commonly used in our lore today was created in this film, but it did make a lot of changes to the lore that was then used in a lot of film. The curse comes from a bite as opposed to being black magic or any other form of witchery, and it's interesting to see how the whole look of the film has kind of been utilized as well in regards to the makeup being taken and the minimalist makeup being used in something like Wolf or Penny Dreadful. I am always interested to see the way people do their werewolves because sometimes it's almost like it's a straight wolf. Other times it's, you know, the wolf man, and then you've got things where it's a lot more minimalistic. In this film, the minimalism really worked in their favor because it worked along with the script, and I enjoy the various elements of the story, and I don't think there's much of a message in it intentionally in any way, but I do think there's certain things that as an audience we can take from it. And for me, this movie is a lot about going a little too far and how that can mess you up. There is a villain in this story, a villain kind of played by Warner Orland, and unfortunately, Orland is a white man. Portraying a Japanese character, and when I first watched it, I was not 100% sure that that was what was going on because Orland does have an appearance that is that they don't have to really do much to put him into roles that he shouldn't be in. So the character is not like a caricature really, and I think that should be a bit of a warning there just in case, because when I initially went into watching this film, I wasn't really sure, and then there were certain moments where this woman who is kind of like the comedic one, she calls him like she calls him something. Like she calls him something, and that 100% like that's yep, that's what they're doing. And while there's many things to say about this film and praise that I think it has well earned, I do think it's important to note that being that this is a film in the 1930s, it did really do its thing in that this character should be played by a actual Japanese person, because it's not like Hollywood was really not having Japanese people. The American film industry at the time did in fact have a lot of Japanese and Chinese people that were behind the camera. There were also actors, and there's really no excuses. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch this video. I didn't necessarily go into as deep of a dive as I wanted to in regards to werewolf lore and how it has changed in comparison to what it was and how it exists in real life folklore and culture, as opposed to where it is now thanks to Werewolf of London, and as well as the extension within the Wolfman and other films as well. If a more deep dive in regards to that is something you might be interested in, please let me know in the comments below. I initially wanted this film to be like that, but I'm kind of in a bit of a row. I'm into really doing my deeper like film noir videos right now. Thanks again for watching my video on Werewolf of London. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any thoughts, let me know in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and ring that bell to be notified every single time I post. I'll see you again. Bye.